The Darksaber supposedly gives the right to rule Mandalore to whomever controls it, but what does any of that actually mean? Season 3 Episode 2 of The Mandalorian prompted some debate about control of the Darksaber when Din was caught by surprise by Sewer Grievous, who was then beaten by Bo-Katan, with some people then thinking that it meant Bo-Katan is now the rightful wielder. I think this misunderstands not just how it's transferred, but also the nature of the weapon and its symbolism within Mandalorian culture. So today we're going to talk about what it actually means to wield the saber, what that means for becoming a fresh new Mandalore, and talk a bit about the political concept of legitimacy. It's tempting to think of the Darksaber as this legally binding object where the rules of transference are hard and fast, and they make you legally the leader of Mandalore. But we've seen time and time again that none of this is really directly true. We've seen challenges in single combat for control of the blade between Darth Maul and Pre Vizsla, as well as between Din Djarin and Paz Vizsla, with the Vizslas taking the loss each time, along with less formal challenges for the Darksaber, like when Din took it from Gideon, or Sabine Wren won it back from Gar Saxon. But we've seen even more combat situations, even single combat, where losing was not understood to mean surrendering the Darksaber. I don't think anyone, particularly any Mandalorian who theoretically operates on some kind of warrior code, would take Din getting tricked and trapped by a helmet in the sand to mean that he was beaten in single combat. And just as importantly, Sewer Grievous wanted his blood, not his blade, so the Darksaber was never really his, and Bo-Katan therefore couldn't claim it from Sewer Grievous in turn. Like we covered with Sabine and Din, there doesn't necessarily have to be a formal challenge for the Darksaber, but it's as much about possession as it is about winning a fight with the prior owner, and you need both of those elements. If you don't have the Darksaber in your possession, you can't really lose it. Sabine Wren in Rebels needed to beat Saxon for anyone to recognize that she had any claim to it, even though it had been in her possession before, much like how Bo-Katan was denied having true ownership of it by the Children of the Watch, for not having beaten anyone to take it since Sabine just gave it to her. We also saw Maul get soundly defeated by Palpatine while using the Darksaber, get captured, and then had the Mandalorians working for Maul free him, directly returning the Darksaber to him, rather than claiming that Palpatine would have been the new owner of the Darksaber and offering the blade and position of Mandalore to him like some sort of magical situation from a different franchise involving wands. If that were the case, Palpatine would have controlled it until Return of the Jedi, even if Darth Maul had possession of it. It would never have been Saxon or Sabine's. If this were how it worked, guess who would be the rightful owner? Well, Vader beat Palpatine ultimately, so you may think it's really Luke's because Luke beat Vader. But Vader beat Palpatine only after Luke had beaten Vader, and it's not a retroactive process. Vader gets it, but then he dies from Palpatine's Force Lightning, whose spirit was transferring elsewhere, which means he spends the next 30 years in charge of it again, and ultimately in Rise of Skywalker say hello to Mandalore Rey. So yeah, for a symbol of leadership, it's obviously not how any of this works. Nobody could reasonably be expected to know how any of that went down, and if someone shows up trying to claim they're the real owner of a Darksaber they'd never seen, let alone held, nobody would really take them seriously. You can't walk up to the person who currently has the Darksaber and then rules lawyer yourself into being the wielder of the Darksaber and thereby Mandalore. If you can't actually hold on to it, then no one's going to take your word for it that you've beaten the right chain of people in the past who should have legally had the Darksaber in their own right. What we really see with the situation where Maul loses to Palpatine is that there has to be some kind of political will behind you having the Darksaber and therefore becoming the leader. You can lead the Mandalorians because you have the Darksaber, but you have the Darksaber because people want you to lead the Mandalorians. Which gets us back to how the saber is less about a strict set of rules and more about cultural norms and the vague political concept of legitimacy. At its core, the question of what is legitimacy as a concept in political science and philosophy gets down to what allows a government to claim the right to govern, and while there are many ways it's been defined in political science, most definitions understand that legitimacy boils down to whatever the governed are willing to accept. This is not a moral argument that whatever an authority may do is legitimate in any kind of ethical sense, just that it describes what allows a government or ruler to exist and act. The easiest framework for us to talk about when dealing with the Mandalorians is sociologist Max Weber's 3 types of legitimacy from politics as a vocation. They're a bit antiquated, but they work for a first-year political science course as well as for our purposes here. These 3 types of legitimacy are the kind that stem from tradition, where a type of rule is accepted because of the historical precedent, the charismatic, where a leader is able to maintain power because of their own personal traits, and the third, a legal framework, where legitimacy is derived from a system of laws being followed by anyone who wants to become leader, and there is a process set in place by that. All of these at their core still involve people buying into the system. As Weber puts it, the relationship between the governed and the governor is based on the legitimate use of force, that is to say, force that is perceived as legitimate. Perceived as being the operating term here. It may seem like something of a tautology to say that something is legitimate because everyone says it's legitimate, but really you're talking about getting people to agree that you're in charge, and these are the kind of frameworks that society can set out for you to do that. In the Mandalorian case, the right to be Mandalore and the right to wield Darksaber rely on these concepts to at least some extent. We've already broken down how it's not solely possession of the Darksaber which gives an immediate right to whatever ownership is meant to represent. You have to convince people that you specifically have earned and embody that right. As Sabine Wren's mother Ursa Wren tells her in Rebels, quote, "Anyone can hold the Darksaber, the trick is keeping it along with your head." Even if you control the Darksaber, we've seen that you can be fully recognized to be the legitimate wielder of the weapon, and yet that doesn't mean you're suddenly able to exercise the right to be Mandalore. That particular tradition isn't enough. I think part of the key is in what Ursa Wren said in that last quote. By maintaining control of the Darksaber, someone is able to represent the traits that the Mandalorians find worth following, especially in periods where they're leaning hardest into those warrior tendencies, bringing in an element of the charismatic aspect of Weber's three types. If you're controlling the Darksaber, you're showing yourself to be the kind of warrior that a lot of those Mandalorians would want to follow. But over time in Star Wars, we've seen that shift. The amount that Mandalorians actually value having that kind of warrior leader has changed over time with their circumstances. And this goes beyond just the ideas of the new Mandalorians being pacifists. Darth Maul was able to take the Darksaber very clearly in a duel explicitly set up as a fight between him and Pre Vizsla as the leader of the Death Watch, and despite his victory, it wasn't enough for even some members of Death Watch, notably Bo-Katan and her Night Owls, to want to follow him. He had the Darksaber he wanted to rule, but different Mandalorians would have different reasons not to follow him. For Bo-Katan, it was because he was an outsider, but for other Mandalorians there would be other reasons as well. Pre Vizsla before him had already been the wielder of the Darksaber, but Death Watch still needed to undermine Satine's regime for the new Mandalorians and other outside Death Watch in general to follow him too. They had to show the value of those old warrior ways by staging an attack on Sundari. So when a wider array of Mandalorians started following him, it wasn't because he had a cool lightsaber, it was because he had proven that he had something that could protect them. When Maul beat Vizsla, he knew he couldn't just wave the Darksaber around and have people follow him either. He needed Prime Minister Almec to basically take over as his public puppet. So we have two different examples of how the Darksaber is at best a symbol, and how that symbol will mean different things to different groups of Mandalorians. The biggest groups we see are Death Watch and the New Mandalorians, with the New Mandalorians having a clearer reason to ignore something so indicative of their warrior past. But I think there's probably a bit more granularity beyond just those two groups being treated as monoliths, as we see with the example of Bo-Katan and the Night Owls. Part of this is the out-of-universe development of the Darksaber as a concept, where it was introduced just as a weapon to allow someone to fight a lightsaber without a regular lightsaber, since George Lucas didn't like the idea of vibroblades. But I think this being wrapped into their culture, traditions, and ideas about legitimacy changing over time makes it more interesting as a concept and a symbol anyways. As the Mandalorians face more and more problems, we see them fall further into their traditions, and their superstitions become more prominent, which is why in Rebels and then in The Mandalorian, we see the emphasis growing more and more on not just the Darksaber, but also the Mythosaur. When Bo-Katan controls the Darksaber during the Empire, she's able to get the loyalty of most of the former Death Watch clans, who seem to be the majority of anyone that's left fighting, but there's still some opposition from others who are working with the Empire. But since she ultimately failed, it reinforced the idea that it hadn't been won through combat by her, so she couldn't have been legitimate. We see the Armorer call her reign cursed as a result. The Children of the Watch may always have felt that way, but clearly the other Mandalorian clans hadn't had a problem with this until after she'd failed, and the Mandalorians had been all but destroyed. In The Mandalorian Season 3, she talks about how her followers have abandoned her because she doesn't have the sword, but if things were going well for them, they probably wouldn't have left. This is all part of why we see Bo-Katan turn down the offer from Din to surrender it after her quest in Season 2. She needed to properly win it for anyone to respect her, considering what happened in Rebels, and now her former followers have moved towards more of the superstitions of the Children of the Watch, that she had a cursed reign for not having won it, even if they wouldn't necessarily use the word cursed. On the flip side, many Mandalorians know Din has the blade, and that he won it, but it's not like any of them are pledging themselves to his service as Mandalore, even those within the Children of the Watch. The fall of the Mandalorian civilization has pushed them more towards their prior ways, and it's certainly starting to move some of those superstitions back to the forefront, helped along by apparently killing most people who weren't already in line with some of them. Yet Din is still not claiming to want to be Mandalore, so nobody is following him. If he did make that claim, it would probably still not be accepted until and unless he proves himself in other ways to various groups. And maybe I should have said this earlier in the video, but I know I'm only using the term Mandalore to refer to the leader of the Mandalorians, and that's not necessarily what would have to happen, but I think everyone understands what I mean here. We're basically getting to the point where the Darksaber becomes a symbol of Mandalorian unification, and is a necessary but not sufficient part of finding a new Mandalore to lead them. The Darksaber can be a way to rally around a new leader, and can be an excuse to follow someone you wanted to for other reasons, but it doesn't tell the whole story. Anyone who succeeds in reuniting the Mandalorians will have to fit more than one idea of what it takes to lead. As Bo-Katan keeps pointing out, the Mandalorians are fractured and constantly infighting, so naturally trying to point to one tradition as being the key to lead them probably won't get you far, or else they would have been united before. The Darksaber is a symbol, and it helps to lend legitimacy, but it's not the whole answer. The Mythosaur probably factors in a similar way, but it may prove to be even more important, and maybe we'll see the Darksaber fall by the wayside. That's going to do it for today's video though. I hope you've enjoyed. If there's another topic you'd like to see explored on the channel, let me know in the comments, and thank you for watching.